A young marathon runner left for her morning jog through Napa scenic trails and never came back. Her car still parked at the trailhead untouched. For 2 agonizing years, her loved ones searched for answers that seemed impossible to find. But then, retired chef's Truffle hunting pig began digging frantically at a remote spot in the woods. And what emerged from the earth was evidence that would expose what really happened that morning. The air in Napa Valley in mid-September carries a unique weight. It's a dry golden heat thick with the scent of sun-baked earth, wild rosemary, and the distant sweet promise of grapes ripening on the vine. For the residents who call this place home, the landscape is more than just rolling hills and world-class vineyards. It's a sprawling backyard of rugged beauty crisscrossed by a network of trails that snake through oak forests and up into the chaparral-covered ridges. These paths are a sanctuary for hikers, mountain bikers, and runners. People drawn to the quiet challenge of the terrain. Veronica Hensley was one of those people. At 28, she moved with the disciplined grace of someone who understood her own body's mechanics. As a physical therapist, her life's work was dedicated to healing and strengthening others, a principle she applied to herself with unwavering rigor. She was an avid marathon runner, a familiar sight on the local trails, her blonde ponytail, a steady metronome against her back as she logged mile after grueling mile. Her friends and family saw her as a beacon of strength and vibrancy, a woman who found as much peace in the solitude of a long run as she did in the company of those she loved. Her boyfriend, David Chen, a software engineer with a shared passion for the outdoors, was often by her side. On the afternoon of Tuesday, September 15, 2020, they jogged together along the familiar dirt path of the Channel Trail, a route locals called the CHNH. As David would later recount to investigators, it was a perfect afternoon. They paused at a well-known junction marked by a weathered wooden signpost. The carved letters read CHNH with an arrow and below it the number 500. He remembered pulling out his phone wanting to capture the moment. Veronica flashed from the run, leaned against the sign, a bottle of water in her hand. She flashed a smile, effortless, radiant, and completely genuine. The click of the phone's camera froze the image in time. Her bright eyes, the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, the backdrop of endless trees and golden grass. It was the last photograph ever taken of her. Their routine was comfortable, established. David had a work conference in Sacramento the next day, a 2-day event he couldn't miss. He left before dawn on Wednesday, September 16th. Their goodbye was brief, a sleepy kiss in the dim light of their apartment, the kind of casual farewell that happens 1,000 times in a life shared. He told her he'd call her that evening from the hotel. He had no way of knowing that the silence on the other end of the line would soon become a deafening roar. The conference hotel in Sacramento was a world away from the dusty trails of Napa. It was a sterile environment of beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and the low hum of air conditioning. David sat through keynote speeches and breakout sessions, his mind occasionally drifting back to the run with Veronica, the feeling of the sun on his skin. Around 7 p.m., he returned to his room, loosened his tie, and dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. He wasn't alarmed, not at first. He pictured her phone battery drained after a long day at the clinic. Or maybe she was out for an evening walk, leaving it behind. He sent a quick text. "Hey, hope you had a good day. Call me when you get this." He ordered room service, watched an hour of television, and tried her again. Voicemail. A small knot of unease began to form in his stomach. Veronica was meticulous. She lived by her schedule and their evening call was a fixed point in their day, especially when one of them was away. He sent another text, this one more direct. Getting a little worried. "Everything okay?" He waited. The 3 dots of a reply never appeared. The silence in the hotel room felt heavier now, amplified by the absence of her voice. By 10 p.m., the unease had sharpened into real concern. He scrolled through his contacts and called Veronica's best friend, Sarah. "Hey, sorry to call so late," he started, trying to keep his voice steady. "Have you heard from Veronica today?" Sarah's response was immediate and laced with her own confusion. "No, I haven't. I was just thinking it was weird she didn't call me back this afternoon." She never does that. The confirmation sent a jolt of cold fear through David. It wasn't just him. No one had heard from her. The carefully constructed logic of a dead battery or a forgotten phone crumbled, replaced by a dark, formless dread. He spent the rest of the night pacing the length of his hotel room, phone in hand, calling her number every 30 minutes. Each time the automated voice on the other end felt like a judgment, a confirmation that she was somewhere he couldn't reach. The hours stretched into an eternity of silence. Each tick of the clock a hammer blow against his hope. The first light of dawn on Thursday, September 17th, brought no relief, only a frantic certainty. David checked out of his hotel before the sun had fully risen and began the drive back to Napa, his mind racing through 1,000 terrible scenarios. As he drove, he made the call he never imagined he would have to make. He dialed 911 and his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, reported Veronica Hensley missing. He explained her routine to the Napa County Sheriff's Office dispatcher with painstaking clarity. Her unwavering habit. A solo run every morning she wasn't working. Always on the CH-NH trail system. She would have left around 8 a.m. on Wednesday. She should have been home by 10 a.m. At the latest. The dispatcher, trained to handle panic with calm procedure, took down the information, and assured him deputies would be dispatched immediately to the trailhead. When David finally arrived, the scene was already cordoned off with yellow tape. 2 patrol cars were parked near the entrance, their presence a stark and official violation of the tranquil setting. And there, tucked away at the far end of the dusty lot, was Veronica's silver sedan. It was locked, undisturbed. A half-empty water bottle sat in the center console. A pair of sunglasses rested on the passenger seat. The car was a silent, chilling testament. She had made it to the trail. She had started her run just as she always did. But somewhere in the vast, sun-drenched wilderness that stretched out beyond the parking lot, Veronica Hensley had vanished, and the search for her had just begun. The initial response from the Napa County Sheriff's Office was swift and by the book. The trailhead, once a peaceful gateway to the wilderness, transformed into the epicenter of a burgeoning investigation. Yellow tape, stark and artificial, against the natural browns and greens of the landscape, cordoned off Veronica's car and a wide perimeter around it. The deputies who first arrived moved with a practiced calm, their faces grim. They photographed the vehicle from every angle, the thin layer of dust on its hood, a silent clock marking the passage of time since she'd arrived. Through the glass, the mundane objects inside, the sunglasses, the water bottle, had taken on a sinister significance. Artifacts of a life abruptly paused. An initial team of deputies made a cursory sweep of the first 100 red yards of the CH-NH trail. They walked slowly, eyes scanning the ground, the brush, the low-hanging branches of the oak trees. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the air still and warm. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call seemed to hold a question. They found nothing. No scuff marks, no dropped keys, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Veronica had simply been erased from the landscape the moment she stepped onto the path. The vastness of the park loomed over them, a silent, indifferent witness. The deputies knew, looking into that dense expanse of trees and hills, that this was not a task for a handful of officers. This would require an army. By midday, that army began to arrive. The parking lot swelled with the vehicles of the Napa County Search and Rescue Team. White trucks and vans emblazoned with the official insignia. A mobile command post, a large RV equipped with radios and satellite links, was established under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. Seasoned volunteers, men and women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, emerged, their faces set with a familiar mixture of determination and solemnity. They were teachers, electricians, and retirees who dedicated their free time to finding the lost. The SAR team leader, a man named Frank Hewitt, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too many of these operations, unrolled a massive topographical map across a folding table. The intricate web of contour lines depicted a brutal terrain of steep ascents, deep ravines, and countless intersecting paths, many of them unofficial and unmaintained. He began marking the map with a red grease pencil, outlining Veronica's probable route, establishing search grids, and assigning sectors to different teams. David stood nearby, a ghost at the edge of the activity, his face pale and drawn. He answered questions, confirmed details about Veronica's gear and fitness level. But his eyes kept drifting to the trail, to the dark opening in the trees that had swallowed the woman he loved. The whir of organization, the crackle of radios, the methodical preparation. It all felt like a terribly inadequate response to the profound, terrifying silence that had fallen over his life. As the ground teams prepared to deploy, the K-9 units arrived. The star of the unit was a German shepherd named Ranger, a veteran of dozens of searches. His handler, a quiet woman named Maria, led him to Veronica's car. She opened the driver's side door and let the dog inhale, his powerful nose cataloging the unique scent signature of the missing woman. After a moment, Ranger let out a low whine and a sharp bark, signaling he had the trail. Maria gave him the command, and the dog surged forward, pulling her toward the trailhead with an eager, confident stride. For the first mile, the dog was relentless. He followed the main dirt path without hesitation, his tail held high, his focus absolute. The search team members following behind felt a surge of cautious optimism. This was how it was supposed to work. The dog was on the scent. A discovery felt imminent. But then they reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight while a smaller, less traveled track veered off to the left, descending into a shaded creek bed. Ranger stopped dead. He winded, his nose twitching frantically as he sniffed the air, then the ground. He took a few steps down the left fork, then doubled back, circling the junction with growing agitation. He looked back at Maria, his confident posture gone, replaced by a visible confusion. The scent trail, so strong just moments before, had vanished into thin air. It was as if Veronica had been lifted from the spot, leaving no trace of which direction she had gone, or if she had left the ground entirely. Maria tried to coax him to have him recast the scent, but the dog was resolute. The trail was cold. The first real hope of the search had evaporated into the dry Napa air, leaving the teams with nothing but a vast, unforgiving wilderness and 1,000 wrong directions to choose from. Back at the command post, detectives were interviewing the few other hikers who had been in the area on Wednesday morning. Most had seen nothing out of the ordinary. But then an elderly couple, the Hendersons, approached a deputy, their faces etched with concern. They explained that they had been hiking on a different trail system, the Lower Ridge Trail, about 3 miles away. Around 11 a.m. on Wednesday, they had been returning to their car when they witnessed a disturbing scene. A young woman with blonde hair matching Veronica's general description was in a heated argument with a man next to a dusty dark blue pickup truck parked at the remote trailhead. They couldn't hear the words, but the man's posture was aggressive and the woman seemed distressed. The lead detective, a man named Bill Sutton, weighed the information. The location was wrong, the time a bit late, but it was the only tangible lead they had. A woman matching the description, an argument, a vehicle. It was a narrative, something to chase. Against the silent void of Veronica's disappearance, it was a siren song. Resources were immediately diverted. A bolo, beyond the lookout, was issued for the blue pickup truck. Patrol cars were sent to cruise the back roads and a team of deputies was dispatched to canvass the Lower Ridge Trail area. For the next 6 hours, a significant portion of the investigation's focus shifted, chasing the phantom blue truck. It was a critical loss of time, a wild goose chase born of desperation that ultimately led nowhere. The man and woman were never identified, and the lead dissolved, leaving behind only the bitter taste of wasted effort. While ground teams contended with dead ends, the search from above was proving equally fruitless. A helicopter from the California Highway Patrol cut through the sky, its blades making a rhythmic whomp 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 that echoed off the canyon walls. From the air, the sheer scale of the park was overwhelming. The spotter strapped into his seat, scanned the landscape through high-powered binoculars, his eyes tracing the endless green and brown tapestry below. But the dense canopy of oaks and mad drones formed a nearly impenetrable shield. He could see the trails, thin ribbons of dirt, but the terrain alongside them was lost in shadow. He saw a deer, a fox, but no flash of color, no sign of a person in distress. Drones offered a more intimate yet equally frustrating perspective. Pilots at the command post guided the small aircraft through ravines and over ridges, their high-resolution cameras feeding a live stream back to monitors. They flew grid patterns, meticulously covering square after square of wilderness. They stared at screens for hours, watching a world of rock and scrub scroll by, hoping for a single pixel that didn't belong. But the drone saw only what the forest wanted them to see. Trees, rocks, and the deep, dark shadows that could hide anything. On the fourth day of the search, a flicker of hope was reignited, this time by a volunteer. His name was Leo, a college student spending his summer break back home. He had been assigned to a brush-busting team tasked with searching the difficult off-trail areas that the main groups bypassed. He was navigating a steep, treacherous slope, choked with thorny manzanita bushes hundreds of yards from the main path where the canine had lost the scent. It was slow, frustrating work. As he pushed a branch aside, a flash of color caught his eye. It was a shocking unnatural pink against the muted tones of the forest floor. He knelt, his heart pounding. Snagged tightly on a thorn was a single brightly colored shoelace. It was clean, almost new. He immediately radioed the command post. The response was electric. David had provided photos of Veronica's running shoes, bright pink Hokas. The shoelace was a perfect match. Within the hour, the area was swarming with S personnel. They established a new grid centered on the location of the shoelace. For the rest of the day, they conducted an inch-by-inch search of the hillside. A painstaking process of clearing brush and sifting through leaf litter. They found nothing else. No other piece of clothing, no backpack, no sign of a struggle, and most importantly, no Veronica. The discovery of the shoelace was both a breakthrough and a torment. It proved she had been there far from the trail, but it offered no explanation as to how or why. Had she been dragged there? Had she run in panic? Had she simply dropped it? The single vibrant clue hung in the air, a question mark suspended over a landscape that refused to provide an answer. As the days wore on, the investigation turned inward as it always does. Detectives sat down with David in a quiet room at the sheriff's station. The questions were polite but probing, designed to dismantle a timeline and expose inconsistencies. They asked him to recount his trip to Sacramento minute by minute. Where did he stop for gas? What time did he check into the hotel? Who did he speak to at the conference? David, hollowed out by grief and lack of sleep, answered them all, his frustration simmering beneath a surface of weary cooperation. While he spoke, another team of detectives was already at work verifying his story. They pulled his credit card records, confirming a purchase at a Starbucks in Sacramento. They obtained security footage from the hotel showing him at the check-in desk at the exact time he'd stated. They subpoenaed his cell phone records, and the tower data was irrefutable. His phone had pinged towers consistently along the I-80 corridor and within Sacramento for the entire duration of Veronica's disappearance. He was without a doubt exactly where he said he was. The lead detective informed him he was cleared. It was a moment that should have brought relief, but for David, it only deepened the despair. If he wasn't responsible, then a stranger was, and that possibility was infinitely more terrifying. After 2 weeks, the relentless Napa sun had baked the ground hard, and the wind had scoured the trails clean. The search had covered over 50 square miles of brutal terrain. The volunteers were exhausted, their hope worn thin. The resources were stretched and the chances of finding Veronica alive had dwindled to almost nothing. On the morning of September 30th, Frank Witt, the SAR commander, made the call. At a brief press conference near the trailhead, he stood before a bank of microphones and announced that the active large-scale search for Veronica Hensley was being suspended. He used formal, careful language, transitioning to a limited, continuous search. Investigation remains open, but the meaning was clear. The army was going home. The command post was dismantled. The maps were rolled up, and the yellow tape was taken down. As the last of the SR trucks pulled out of the parking lot, David and Veronica's sisters stood together at the edge of the trail. The familiar sounds of the search, the radios, the helicopters, the shouts of the volunteers were gone, replaced by the profound and terrible silence of the wilderness. The forest had taken its secret, and for now it was refusing to give it back. A year is a long time. It's long enough for seasons to turn, for wounds to scar over, and for the sharp edges of a crisis to be worn smooth by the relentless rhythm of daily life. For the public, the story of the missing Napa runner had faded. Her face, once a fixture on local news and community bulletin boards, was now rarely seen. Other tragedies, other headlines, had taken its place. The yellow ribbons that had once adorned the trees near the trailhead had frayed and fallen, absorbed back into the landscape. In the fall of 2021, a year after the search was suspended, Veronica Hensley's case was officially moved to the cold case files of the Napa County Sheriff's Office. It was a procedural step, a quiet acknowledgement that all leads had been exhausted. The thick binder containing her case filled with topographical maps, witness statements, and the single lonely photograph of a pink shoelace was placed on a shelf alongside dozens of others. Each file represented a life interrupted, a story without an ending. To the system, Veronica was now a statistic, a puzzle waiting for a missing piece that might never be found. The wilderness had won. But for Veronica's family, there was no such thing as a cold case. Her absence was a raw daily presence, a void that time could not fill. Her younger sister, Jessica, became the family's unwilling torchbearer. A graphic designer by trade, she channeled her grief into action. She created a Facebook page, Find Veronica Hensley, which quickly became a digital hub for a small but fiercely dedicated community of supporters. She posted the last photo David had taken, Veronica's bright smile, a stark contrast to the growing darkness of the mystery. She shared memories, anecdotes, and pleas for information. Her posts a constant refusal to let her sister's story be forgotten. On the anniversary of Veronica's disappearance, Jessica organized a memorial run. Dozens of people from the local running community would gather at the CHNH trailhead. Their mood a somber mix of remembrance and defiance. They would run the first mile. The trail together, a silent procession of footsteps on the dusty path before returning to the parking lot to share stories and release balloons into the vast indifferent sky. It was a ritual of hope in the face of hopelessness. A way of keeping Veronica's spirit alive in the very place she was last seen. Meanwhile, in the shadowy corners of the internet, Veronica's story took on a different life. On Reddit forums and true crime blogs, amateur sleuths dissected every detail of the case. Theories multiplied like spores in the dark. Some argued for a tragic accident, a fall into an undiscovered ravine. Her body hidden by the dense terrain. Others pointed to a mountain lion attack, citing the remote location and the lack of a struggle at the trailhead. A more persistent theory was that of a planned disappearance. Had Veronica, despite her seemingly happy life, simply walked away? The lack of evidence was to some evidence in itself. She was fit, smart, and knew the wilderness. Could she have orchestrated her own vanishing? The idea, though painful for her family, offered a sliver of hope that she might still be alive somewhere. 18 months after Veronica vanished in the spring of 2022, a terrifying incident sent a ripple of fear through the Napa community and briefly reignited interest in her case. A woman in her early 20s was jogging on a trail about 5 miles from where Veronica had disappeared. She reported being followed by a man in a nondescript older model sedan. He had parked at a turnout and watched her as she ran past. On her return loop, he was standing outside his car. As she approached, he exposed himself to her before jumping back into his vehicle and speeding away. The woman, though shaken, was able to provide a vague description of the man and his car. The incident was chillingly reminiscent of the false lead from the initial search. The man arguing with a woman by a pickup truck. The fear of a trail predator stalking the parks around Napa resurfaced with a vengeance. The sheriff's office increased patrols and issued public warnings. For a few weeks, Veronica's case was pulled from the cold case files. Detectives re-examined the possibility that she had been the victim of a random predatory attack. Was the man who exposed himself the same person who had abducted Veronica? The theory was compelling, but ultimately it led nowhere. The man was never identified. No other incidents were reported. The blue pickup truck from the initial sighting remained a ghost. With no new evidence to connect the flasher to Veronica's disappearance, the brief flicker of activity on her case died down. The file was returned to the shelf, and the void of the last 18 months settled back in, deeper and more silent than before. The trail predator, if he even existed, remained a shadow, and the truth of what happened to Veronica Hensley remained buried somewhere in the hills, waiting. 2 years after Veronica's disappearance, the vibrant greens of a Napa spring had. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with a sudden, sickening clarity. The missing runner, the news reports from 2 years ago, the photos of the smiling blonde woman in her running gear, the clothes in the bag, they matched. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone what this was. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her smartphone. "Hold it up, Michael," she said, her voice thin and shaky. "Don't move it. Just hold it up." Michael, his face, pale and grim, held the bag aloft. The autumn sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the disturbing contents. Sarah snapped a photo, the click of the shutter unnaturally loud in the silent woods. Then another. She knew how important this was to capture the evidence exactly as it was found, before it was disturbed, before the story it told could be altered. They stood there for a long moment, the two of them and the pig, guardians of a terrible discovery. They knew they couldn't touch it further. They had to call the police. The drive out to meet the deputies felt surreal. They left the bag where it was, marking the spot with a bright orange ribbon tied to a tree branch. When they finally met two Napa County Sheriff's deputies on a remote dirt road, their story tumbled out in a rush of panicked, fragmented sentences. They showed the deputies the photos on Sarah's phone. One of the deputies, a veteran detective named Dave Riley, felt a jolt of recognition as he looked at the image. He had been a junior detective when Veronica Hensley vanished. He remembered the posters, the fruitless searches, the photo of her in that same pink and white top. He remembered the single pink shoelace. This wasn't just a potential lead. This was the case ripped open after 2 years of silence. The discovery sent a shock wave through the department. The quiet of the cold case unit was shattered. Within hours, the remote patch of woods was transformed into a major crime scene, cordoned off with miles of yellow tape. Forensic teams in white suits descended on the area, conducting a meticulous grid search around the old oak tree. The bag was carefully excavated, sealed in an evidence container and rushed to the state crime lab in Sacramento. At the lab, the work began immediately. The clothes were carefully separated and examined. Under the harsh lights of the forensic lab, they were undeniably Veronica's. The style, the brand, the colors, they were a perfect match to the photos David had provided. The focus then shifted to the most critical pieces of evidence, the condom and the tampon. Scientists in sterile labs began the painstaking process of extracting DNA. Working against the degradation of time and the elements. They were searching for a ghost, a genetic profile that could give a name to the shadow who had haunted this case for 2 years. The entire investigation now hinged on what secrets those tiny discarded items held. The California Department of Justice Crime Lab in Sacramento operates in a world of sterile precision, a place where microscopic traces can unravel the most complex of crimes. For the forensic scientists assigned to Veronica Hensley's case, the evidence bag represented both a challenge and a profound opportunity. 2 years of exposure to moisture, bacteria, and fluctuating temperatures in the soil could easily have destroyed any viable DNA. The team worked with a quiet, intense focus, knowing that the hopes of a family and a police department rested on their efforts. Days turned into a week. Then the breakthrough came. The lab successfully extracted a full viable male DNA profile from the used condom. The sample was clean, uncompromised. It was a long shot, but it was the best shot they'd had since the search began. The profile was immediately uploaded to the Combined DNA Index System, or KDS, a vast national database containing the genetic fingerprints of convicted felons, arrests, and unidentified crime scene evidence. The system began its search, cross-referencing the profile against millions of entries. The wait was agonizing. Then a hit. The DNA profile from the condom matched an existing entry in the database. The name that flashed on the screen was Mark Jennings, a 45-year-old landscaper living in a small unassuming rental house on the outskirts of Napa. His entry in COTA stemmed from a decade-old conviction for indecent exposure, a misdemeanor that had required him to submit a DNA sample. It was a minor offense, but to the detectives on the case, it was a glaring red flag. Predators often start small and escalate. The name Mark Jennings sent a jolt of electricity through the Napa County Sheriff's Office. Detective Riley and his team immediately launched a covert surveillance operation. They pulled Jennings's records. He was a quiet loner with no close family, a man who kept to himself. He ran a small independent landscaping business which gave him a legitimate reason to be all over the county, including near the trail systems and parks. He was a ghost hiding in plain sight. For the next week, a surveillance team shadowed Jennings's every move. They watched from unmarked cars as he went about his daily routine, buying supplies at a garden center, mowing lawns in quiet suburban neighborhoods, eating alone at cheap diners. His life seemed mundane, almost pitiably so. But then they observed a more disturbing pattern. Several times they tailed his beat-up work truck as he drove slowly past various trailheads and parks throughout the county, including popular jogging spots near Lake Hennessy and Skyline Park. He wouldn't stop, but he would slow his vehicle to a crawl, his gaze lingering on the female joggers running along the paths. The way he watched them was predatory. A hunter assessing his prey. The behavior was chillingly consistent with their theory. He wasn't just a landscaper, he was a stalker. Armed with the COTA's match and the damning surveillance footage, the detectives had more than enough to secure a warrant. They planned the operation with meticulous care. This was not a man they could risk spooking. On a cool, foggy morning just before dawn, a SWAT team descended on Jennings's small house. The raid was swift and overwhelming. They breached the door with a battering ram, the sharp crack echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Jennings was found in his bed, startled from sleep. He offered no resistance, his expression one of bewildered confusion rather than fear or guilt. He was handcuffed and led out to a waiting patrol car, his face illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights. While Jennings was being transported to the station, a forensic team began a systematic search of his house. It was sparse and tidy, the home of a man who lived a solitary life. But the digital world held his secrets. On his old desktop computer, a forensic analyst uncovered a hidden password-protected folder. Inside were hundreds of photographs, all taken with a powerful telephoto lens. They were candid, invasive pictures of women. The women were unaware they were being photographed. Their moments of private exertion captured and catalogued by an unseen voyeur. Among the files were dozens of photos of Veronica, some dating back weeks before her disappearance. Jennings had been obsessed with her. In the sterile gray interrogation room, Mark Jennings sat in silence. He was a stark contrast to the monster they had imagined. He was physically unimposing with thinning hair and a soft paunchy middle. He answered basic questions with quiet one-word answers, his eyes avoiding contact. Detective Riley began by placing a photo of Veronica on the table. Jennings glanced at it, his face betraying no emotion. For hours, he denied everything. He claimed he'd never seen her before, never been to that trail. Then Riley played his trump card. He slid a copy of the lab report across the table. Your DNA, Mark, it was found inside a condom buried with her clothes. Explain that. Jennings stared at the paper, his facade beginning to crack. His breathing became shallow. He shifted in his chair, the calm demeanor dissolving into a twitchy defensiveness. He didn't confess. Not yet. But the denial stopped. Finally, after another hour of relentless patient questioning, the dam broke. The confession that spilled out was horrifying. Not for its passion, but for its cold, detached nature. He spoke of Veronica with a chilling sense of ownership. He had watched her for weeks, he said, memorizing her running schedule. He described his fantasy, his obsession. On the day she disappeared, he had waited for her on a remote, overgrown section of the trail, ambushing her. His account of the assault was delivered in a flat monotone, but it was his justification that truly shocked the seasoned detectives. She was asking for it, Jennings said, his voice devoid of emotion. Running around like that in those short clothes, so beautiful. "It's not my fault. A man can only take so much." He admitted that he had killed her when she fought back, strangling her in a moment of rage. He then buried her clothes in one location and her body in another, a calculated move to throw off any potential investigation. The confession was a victory, but it was an incomplete one. Veronica was still missing. As part of a plea agreement to take the death penalty off the table, Jennings agreed to lead them to her body. The next day, a grim procession of police vehicles followed Jennings's directions deep into another even more remote section of the Napa wilderness, miles from where the Petrovs had found the bag. He pointed to a spot beneath a cluster of bay trees. After hours of careful excavation, Veronica's remains were finally recovered. She was coming home. The investigation didn't end there. The hundreds of photographs found on Jennings's computer became a haunting puzzle for detectives. As they meticulously catalogued the images, they began cross-referencing the women in the photos with unsolved missing persons cases from neighboring counties. The work was painstaking, matching faces, clothing, and locations. Then came the chilling breakthroughs. A distinctive sea turtle keychain visible on a backpack in one photo matched the description of an item belonging to a 22-year-old college student who had vanished while walking her dog in a Sonoma County park 5 years earlier. In another image, a woman wore a unique silver hoop earring that family members confirmed belonged to another missing woman from a year before that. The horrifying truth settled in. Mark Jennings was not an opportunistic killer who had made one fatal mistake. He was a serial predator who had been hunting in the hills of Northern California for years, methodically photographing his victims before they disappeared. His quiet life, a perfect cover for the monster lurking within. The news was delivered to Veronica's family in the quiet of their living room. It was the answer they had spent 2 years praying for and dreading in equal measure. The uncertainty was over, but it was replaced by a brutal, devastating certainty. Mark Jennings was sentenced to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison. For the families of his victims, it wasn't justice. Not really. Nothing could bring back their loved ones. But it was an ending. The shadow that had stalked the trails had finally been brought into the light, and the woods, for now, were safe again. The arrest and confession of Mark Jennings sent a tremor of shock and fear through the tight-knit communities of Napa Valley. He was not a monster from a distant city, but a local man, a familiar, unassuming face who had moved silently among them. The beloved trails, once seen as places of refuge and natural beauty, were suddenly recast as hunting grounds. The story dominated local news for weeks. Female joggers and hikers spoke of a newfound unease of looking over their shoulders on paths they had once traveled without a second thought. The case became a catalyst for change. In the wake of the revelations, local authorities and park services faced a groundswell of public pressure to improve safety. Town hall meetings were packed with concerned citizens demanding action. In response, the Napa County Parks Department significantly increased ranger patrols on the more popular trail systems. They cleared brush to improve sight lines and in a more technologically advanced measure, began installing emergency solar-powered call boxes at major trail heads, including the CH-NH 500. The changes were a direct result of Veronica's tragedy, a community's attempt to reclaim its sense of security. Months later, after the legal proceedings had concluded, Veronica Hensley was finally laid to rest. The service was private, attended by family and close friends who shared memories of her vibrant spirit, her infectious laugh, and her unwavering dedication. But the community needed a public way to mourn and to remember. The running club she had been a part of, in collaboration with her family, raised funds to dedicate a memorial bench in her name. It was placed at the CH-NH trailhead, positioned to overlook the start of the path she had loved so much. The story of Veronica's disappearance and the capture of her killer is a dark tapestry woven with threads of tragedy, obsession, and police work. But it is impossible to tell without acknowledging the final improbable thread, the one of pure chance. The resolution hinged on a series of events so unlikely they border on the miraculous. If Michael Petro, the retired chef, hadn't chosen that specific remote patch of woods for his truffle hunt that October morning, if his pig, Rosie, with her keen and determined snout, hadn't been drawn to that exact spot beneath the old oak tree, if she hadn't dug with such unusual insistence, if Michael and Sarah hadn't understood the gravity of what they'd found, and had the presence of mind to preserve the scene. If any one of those things had not happened, the plastic bag containing the key to the entire mystery might have remained buried in the earth for decades, its secrets slowly decaying into nothing. Mark Jennings would have continued his quiet, predatory existence, perhaps claiming more victims, his dark hobby hidden behind the mask of a lonely landscaper. It was a stark reminder that sometimes in the search for justice, the most crucial clue can be unearthed not by technology or forensics, but by the simple, persistent instinct of an animal searching for a treasure in the dirt.